It's Levi McGrath. You are in control. You're on Vision Christian Radio. Neil with you, the Friday edition of 2020. A conversation, it does get controversial when we start talking drugs. You might like to join in your own 2 bobs worth. You might have a question, a comment, even a critique for the conversation as it unfolds today. Shortly, we'll open our talkback lines. Well, more states and territories are moving to decriminalise drugs. How do you think this will impact our teenagers, our young people, as they face legalised temptation? The push to decriminalise recreational drugs like heroin, cocaine and speed is gaining pace. Well, since the ACT's drug law reform announcement late last year, there's been a lot of talk about decriminalisation and other drug policy changes. And from the 28th of October in the ACT, penalties for personal possession of small amounts of the most commonly used illicit drugs will be reduced. And what do we make of the push to legalise cannabis? We're talking today about these changes and how they might affect you, your family and your community, and which states are likely to follow. We're back with Drug Educator Shane Varcoe. He's CEO at Dalgarno Institute, one of the 400-plus member organisations of the World Federation Against Drugs. Shane, a special welcome back to 2020.
Oh, thank you for having me, Neil. Always good to be here with you, mate.
Shane, we'll talk about the states and territories and who does what so far as this decriminalisation and a push for legalisation happens. But before we do, let's just talk a few definitions here, because it seems to be a lot of people tend to lump all these together. The destigmatisation, decriminalisation and legalisation. How do you make sense of those?
Yeah, look, it is and I think there's a deliberate engagement of the potential confusion by the bad actors in the culture who just like to kind of water down definitions. Certainly legalisation is the ultimate cultural permission vehicle that can be given to anything. Now, once a legislature establishes something as legal, it becomes almost a right, regardless of its outcome, and that's one of the issues that's concerning us, and that's dangerous. Decriminalisation and depenalisation, they're words that can be interchangeable, but depenalisation is a little bit less than decriminalisation. Basically, so we lower some of the penalties involved, but decriminalisation also goes to the next level, that there can be it's a very small difference, and it depends on the definitions and the people you're talking to who uses what definition. Decriminalisation takes it a bit further, where the criminal sanctions around it can be actually removed and erased. Now, we, as Dalgarno Institute, and we'll go back to the destigmatisation one in a moment, but the Dalgarno Institute certainly not advocating that we arrest our way out of the problem. That's been on the table for a long time. But we also know that any move to any permission model that's put in play only adds to the permission dynamic that presents to people. So there's a formula that we presented publicly about 10, 11 years ago, 12 years ago. Basically this: availability, accessibility, and acceptability all increase consumption. It's a law. Those 3 things, it's a law. That when you have availability, acceptability and accessibility, consumption goes up. Now, when it comes to psychotropic toxins, drugs, now that's a real concern, particularly for the emerging generation, because we know what drugs do to the developing brain up to the age of 30. So it's a real concern when cultures wink at it, certainly, and give a free pass to it, but then also then give full-blown permission. That creates a real problem. And of course, destigmatisation, again, that's another term that's being sadly manipulated. No one wants to stigmatise a drug user, but at the same time, what we're seeing happen is those terms are being used to basically silence any commentary about the action of drug taking and the consequences of drug taking, which is totally unacceptable.
Shane, is it true to say that the drug use problem now in Australia is so big that it's out of control by law enforcement, That's why you have to have all of these lessening penalties and ways that you move to decriminalise and even move to legalise, because the courts are clogged with people who were charged with having possession or use of or selling drugs. It's too big a problem, and this is the way that our governments are dealing with it.
Well, again, the argument is then, okay, if it's a problem, this is the concern we have, of course, that is it a problem that's been created by permission models and by a failure to engage in a holistic approach to the problem, or is it a problem because we've simply, again, got basically a cultural dynamic that's being allowed to reinforce the drug use culture? Now, to give you an example, the juxtaposing of the legal drug of tobacco, which is really important here, Neil. The legal drug of tobacco, again, a sanctioned, legally endorsed product by the states, alcohol and tobacco. They are two substances in the National Drug Strategy, and illicit drugs being the third of those categorised substances in the National Drug Strategy. So when it comes to the tobacco issue, then there's only one message, one focus, one voice. We've spoken about this before in the marketplace. It's quit. So the entire culture, media, education, government, health practice, health communities, school communities, all have one message, one focus, one voice: quit, quit, quit. Now, this is a legal drug, so people can buy it, and with some restrictions, and they can use it. Now, this mechanism, then with legislation, starts to slow down use and uptake and reduces use. But when it comes to illicit drugs, there's a whole different dynamic. We've basically set in motion with policy, bad policy practice, a permission model that says, hey, you're probably going to use, just be careful when you use. Keep using, just don't die. Keep using, just don't die. So people are using, and of course, when you deal with an addictive substance that creates dependency very, very fast, of course, that snowballs very quickly, and of course, that escalates, and then the police are saying, oh, we can't deal with it. So what do? That's the narrative that was created by the bad actors. Oh, we back away from it, and of course, that just unleashes it more. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense, which is a really toxic way of managing policy. And we've seen this come over the last 10 years and been fighting actively against it. And unfortunately, some of the bad actors have got their levers on the policy levers, and they're the ones creating some of this havoc at the moment.
I know our listeners will be interested in what's happening in their state or territory. I mentioned the ACT issue, and it's featured quite strongly in a lot of commentary that's been happening on this program now over a number of years. But you've got states like South Australia and the territories, the ACT and the Northern Territory, they have in-law decriminalisation, and it seems to be that in other states you've got in-practice decriminalisation. So a little bit of a differentiation there, because even if they haven't got the law, there's still a decriminalisation that's happening because people are turning a blind eye to illicit drug use. How do you see a current state of play? And maybe you've got a list in front of you, I don't know, about all the different states and territories. Listeners, no doubt, all around Australia are wondering where their state or territory is at.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one because this is in flux, and people are submitting, and in the public space, they're submitting, for example, the legalized cannabis party have been pushing, they landed this in 3 states, New South Wales, Victoria and WA, where they both got elected representatives. They tabled their own bills to legalise cannabis for recreational use. So that's hit the table earlier this year. We saw that coming, and we made preemptive submissions to all those states, and particularly in the upper house, to challenge the narrative that cannabis is everywhere, everyone's using it. And of course, that's the biggest one, cannabis. Unfortunately, that cannabis is now again. Repeatedly, the evidence is in that it's no longer a theory. It's an active proposition that cannabis, along with alcohol and nicotine, are gateway drugs to harder drug use. Certainly not everyone who uses cannabis goes on to use harder drugs. That's true. But we also know that these are triggers for harder drug use, particularly with those with a predilection to perhaps mental health illness. But anyway, so the other states that are looking at this at the moment, Queensland, I believe, under the radar, because only one house in Queensland have decriminalised drug use. Again, trying to deal with, and the meth issue is a real big problem. And that's a devastating problem. And of course, high-end THC cannabis has a very similar manifestation as crystal meth does in many of its users. So you've got these violent aberrations being seen in the marketplace because, again, drug use is continuing to be allowed. Now, if decriminalisation was about reducing drug use, I want to put this in. If it was about reducing drug use and helping people exit drug use, then diversion programs, or it's all those things which are great drug courts we advocate for, have been great advocates for drug courts for years, or problem-solving courts, as they're called, and they work. And so we don't have to criminalise people without changing the law. And decriminalisation, what it does is it basically weakens the potential for diversion because, again, people pay what they did in Portugal. Oh, we had this great miracle in Portugal, which turned out not to be a miracle after all. And it's a model that could not be replicated around the world because it came out of a different context, that aside. But the issue here is that all these things have done in these states that have decriminalised is increased drug use. And with increased substance use, you have increased potential for not just personal harms, Neil, but the harms to family, to others in the community. That's the biggest concern here. And that the more drug use, the greater chance of dependency, the greater chance of activities and behaviours that are not just socially unacceptable, but are dangerous, harmful, and actually occupational health and safety, community safety, community health and well-being are all at jeopardy the more we do this. And that is contra to good public health policy. So that's my concern. And of course, other states, Victoria is now trying to toy with the idea as well. So again, cannabis has been that gateway, if you like, to decriminalisation mechanisms too.
We didn't mention WA. Are you across things that are happening in WA? And I don't think we mentioned Tasmania. Any thoughts around those
Tassie,
states?
as I understand, Tassie still hasn't looked at that. WA, it's interesting. Historically, WA and even SA, I think, now I've got to be careful about here because I'm not the exact data here, but WA did decriminalise cannabis years ago, decades ago, then recriminalised it. So that's interesting, as I understand it. So, because they realised the effect, now they're going back to that again. South Australia, I think, had done that previously as well, but I don't want to be quoted as, I'm not 100% sure on that, but South Australia may have done that as well and recriminalised as well. So again, the idea of decriminalisation, depenalisation, it should be about helping people exit drug use. But what it does is it gives greater permission for, and as I said before, increases the consumption dynamic, which is just a self-fulfilling prophecy of harm.
So diversion is good. So when you think of what might happen if a police officer comes across a person who has drugs on them or is using drugs, diversion is good. But on the back of decriminalisation, it's likely to lead to increased drug use and therefore increased addiction and then all of the social problems that flow from that with this permission model. That's where I think you're at when you describe that sort of thing. Those sorts of things that are at work where you've got our police officers offering diversions, some of them offering cautions. So, in other words, just a caution. I'm going to let you off this time, but don't do it again.
Sure. Sure.
And then fines. Are these, if you take the softly approach, what about the difficulties that are associated with that? Any thoughts from you here, Shane?
Look, it's a really fine line. And this is the thing. I remember speaking with the then head of the New South Wales Police Force about 10 years ago. I had a private meeting with him and very concerned about the drug use. And he's the one who one of the first guys to say we can't arrest our way out of this. And we concur. But one of the things that we need to say quite clearly here is that, Neil, to your listeners, is we cannot treat our way out of this problem either. In fact, that model of, let's just let it off the leash and we'll manage the damage is not just untenable, it is fiscally unsound on every level. Our already overburdened health systems are going to be just inundated because the implications of drug use are not just short, but they're long-term, and not just acute, but they're chronic. And so we've got these ongoing harms. Now, when it comes to the diversion model, this is where it's really important. When it's in some places, these penalties can keep mounting up. But that's the difficulty about the moment. If the idea is we will monitor this and the person then, after they've breached it 3 times, now this is being caught 3 times, not using 3 times, then they have to go into a diversion program. Unfortunately, it's usually just a detox for 7 days. So they do go and do this 7 days, come out and back on the gear again. It's like, just make sure you don't get caught. But the difficulty with psychotropic toxins, and this is where I think people really misunderstand it. Similarly what happened with the drinking laws in Victoria, when they decriminalised public drunkenness. And that was aimed particularly for unfortunately for Indigenous people, which is unfair on them because they they're misrepresented in this context, because non-Indigenous Australians are far more likely to be involved in addictive behaviours with alcohol than Indigenous Australians. But it's interesting when we had these deaths in custody because of some of the conduct and behaviour of those arrested. So they sort of will solve that problem by decriminalising public drunkenness. Now, a lot of Indigenous commentators come out and say, we've got a real concern about this. It's like we understand the practice of what you're trying to do, but what's going to mean is there's going to be an escalation of other criminal charges. So, if, for example, if I see a police officer see someone drunk in public, they've not done anything necessarily bad. They're behaving probably loudly, rudely, they're staggering about, they're being a nuisance. So they're picked up, right, and they should be taken to a place for care, and that's what they're trying to do right now. But by rather than slotting them in jail, they need to go to a safe environment. We call it secure welfare. I think that's a great model. But if that's not done, they're just drunk, just leave them alone. Wait for them to do something illegal. They assault someone, they smash do some vandalism, public damage, and then we arrest them. So instead of intervening at the level of, okay, they're intoxicated, let's intervene now, we have to wait for them to do something dangerous and more illegal, then we arrest them. And then, of course, now they're saying, but I was drunk, I'm not responsible. Well, the Victorian government even put in play, there was on the books, that because ambulance drivers weren't showing up to events because they were being assaulted for the substance use of the person they were attending. And they said they would not attend unless there were police officers there. And now they made laws, not that they didn't get through on the books, but they made laws, potential laws, saying that you cannot use your intoxicated state as an excuse for your conduct. Because people go, I was drunk, I didn't mean to bash the policeman, I didn't mean to bash the ambulance driver. It's like, so you've got this escalation problem. And this is the real issue here. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to help people exit drug use, or are we just giving them a free pass on drug use and hoping it doesn't make it worse? And that's the catch-22 we're kind of in.
It sounds like a free pass, but listeners might have their own contribution. And let me open talkback lines, invite you to join in. It's one of those conversations you might have your own wisdom to offer here. 1-800-316-316, 1-800-316-316. We're talking really around the issue, and we'll get to this very shortly. How will a new generation resist legalized temptation? Shane Varcoe is our guest. He's CEO at Dalgarno Institute. We're back with more in just a few moments. 1-800-316-316 to have your say about these issues we're talking about today around drugs. Our special guest is Shane Varcoe. He's CEO at Dalgarno Institute. So 1-800-316-316. Before we take any calls, Shane, let me just come to this thought that we began to introduce, and that thought is, how will a new generation resist legalised temptation? Because it seems to be that some of these laws sound okay to people who've got a mature outlook on their life, but there's children coming into teenage years, and how will they approach these things? Doesn't seem to be very wise to neglect how that generation is being treated right now. Any thoughts here from you?
Absolutely. I think there's a fundamental premise that's being overlooked here. And without going into too much socio-political sort of theory, there's basically one of the Westminster foundational democratic principles for operating. One of the basic ones is that Western democracies are to keep their people from harm as best they can, and to help them be as productive as citizens as they can. Now, that's a fundamental premise of Western democracies. Now, that means that, and as most of Western democracies were based on Judeo-Christian principles and values, so best practice was in play. And the idea is that, okay, we want to prevent anything that's going to interfere with best practice, health, well-being, productivity, life, society, community. And of course, substance use, and alcohol being the primary one, it was an interrupter of that. And so it had to be managed. And the misuse of alcohol had to be managed. So that created its own set of problems. Now, when the grown-ups are too busy defending it. Now, once we've lost a perspective around what it means to be a strong, ethical culture that's focusing on the well-being and the safety of all its citizens, and we become a culture that's only invested in my interests, my wants, my desires, ostensibly hedonism, then all of a sudden I've got the power to make legislation to make my life as fun as I want it to be. Now, when the grown-ups step into that space, when the grown-ups are running that narrative, you've got a real problem. Because, one of the things about a culture, and the Western culture particularly, when we dismantled rites of passage for young people about 120, 130 years ago, we dismantled that. Then adolescence became the new norm. It was actually a post-World War II construct. So young people hit this kind of stage where they're supposed to be developing, not rebelling and experimenting, but looking for exploration and reward as they were designed to be. And all of a sudden, they're not given the capacity to build resiliency, to build strong worldview, sustainability. All of a sudden, they're just following the urges, moods, and symptoms that are around them. And this is where the culture starts to inform them inappropriately. So in a lot of words there, but it's really important to understand that what happens for young people is that they follow the cues of the grown-ups. Well, the grown-ups are saying, hey, party hard, let's have fun. I can do it. Hey, but wait till you're 18, man. Like, I know it's not good for you. When you're 18, wink, wink. When you're 18, you can have a beer, wink, wink. When you're 18, you can puff on a joint, wink, wink. When you're 18, you can watch porn, wink, wink. When you're 18, you can gamble. And so the kids go, okay, this is what grown-ups do. I want to be a grown-up now. So they engage. And, of course, when it comes to psychotropic toxins like drug use, all those other things can have severe impact on the brain and the maturation process. But we know substances do that faster than anything else. They recalibrate the body and the psyche of the person. So it's a real concern when that's kind of foisted on young people and they don't have a sound resiliency base to resist it, which is one of the things we set up. We'll talk about that later on.
Okay, well, let's take some calls. Colin is in Bundaberg in Queensland. Hi, Colin. Welcome along.
Hey, Colin.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you, Neil?
Good. Colin, what are your thoughts for our conversation?
Well, I've found that previous conversation to be quite enlightening. But I go back a little bit further, and I just say that drugs like retinol, ADHD drugs, are actually a gateway for kids to get involved with other drugs. So from ADHD, they're into that mind-altering sort of drugs, and then they progress on to cannabis, etc., and then from there on to other harder things. So I think it starts back with trying to drug kids on what are legitimate drugs, but I think there's an issue there.
Well, that's interesting because you could even say, well, giving children paracetamol might be a gateway too. But you've got a point here. What are your thoughts here, Shane, for Colin?
Colin, thank you for your comments. So, look, it is interesting. I remember being approached by a WA politician about 8 or 9 years ago, and I'm sorry, I cannot remember his name, but he was a big advocate against the misuse of behaviour managing pharmaceuticals, because he was seeing a misuse of drugs like retinol. Is it retinol? Retinol, sorry. And Ritalin, that's the word I'm looking for, Ritalin. So, and again, genuine substances, pharmaceuticals for a genuine application under medical supervision. No argument there. But again, the misuse of that and the misapplication of that can be a problem. Some behavioural issues are not pharmacologically manageable. And it's a behaviour issue, not a pharmacology issue. So there's got to be a real care there. You're right. Once a substance has any psychotropic effect, the ability to change the mind or mood, that can trigger all sorts of things in the developing brain, because the amygdala, hippocampus, and the developing brain are all working together, and those they can react quite badly to those arrangements. And Neil's comment, the throwaway on Panadol is still a concern. We're dealing with young people in schools, young ladies, 13, 14-year-old, were taking, going back again 10 years ago, were taking 20 to 30 ibuprofen before the day started. And they were asked, why are you doing this? Because just in case we do get pain, period pain, or we just don't want it, we want to stop it before it happens. So they were self-medicating to prevent pain rather than actually managing pain that may present. So again, with this analgesic culture, to quote a famous author, Dr. John Smith, he said, we live in an analgesic culture where we think we can manage everything with a pill. And we may feel better, but we're only getting worse, which is the reality of substance use on the biochemical unit that is the human body.
Colin, thank you so much for your contribution. Our talkback line open on 1-800-316-316. Let's take another call. Alex is in Malanda in North Queensland. Hi, Alex. Welcome along.
Hey, Alex.
Yeah, no worries. What I'm going to tell you is if you give open slander to drugs, then won't you have depression and all the other things that accompany, and crime goes up more? So isn't our politicians really are they doing it for us, or are they doing it for themselves because their mate wants it free?
Good thoughts, Alex. Your response?
Alex, you've nailed it, Alex. You've nailed it. We've written a number of times on this issue. I said, look, it seems to me drug policy adjustments seem to be more about giving permission to a growing number of so-called sophisticated substance users so they can use with impunity, in other words, without getting caught or in trouble. And unfortunately, the side effect of that is some of these people are politicians, and we've even advocated for drug testing for politicians before they go into Parliament. We think that's a fair statement. Other decision-making bodies, including enforcement agencies and emergency services, have to be drug tested. Working sites, why not politicians? And it'd be interesting to see what would come from that particular manifestation, particularly those who are advocating for the use of cannabis on a recreational level. So our concern is, you're dead right. This is more about protecting the using behaviours of certain people groups rather than it is about helping people exit drug use. And your comment about crime, which we did touch on previously, is absolutely validated there, Alex. I think it's a real concern. Crime will go up. It does go up. I mean, behaviours lead to actions, not least the road toll. You want to weaponise a vehicle? Put a drunk or a drug-infected person behind the wheel. That's how you weaponise a vehicle. And so that's just one level, let alone acquisitional crimes, let alone violence. Certainly domestic and familial and intimate partner violence is huge in the alcohol and other drug space. And it's all that data, that violence has been collapsed into mental health issues, where it's really substance use that's created the mental health issue that's created this manifestation of violence. But we blame the drug, and we say we blame mental health, not the drug. And I think that's a real concern for our culture. And when you got politicians, as you said, protecting that space, we've got a problem.
Alex in Malanda, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line remains open on 1-800-316-316. You might like to join in our conversation. We're about to go to news, and we'll continue to take calls after Vision National News. So 1-800-316-316, all sorts of questions coming to mind that we can run by our special guest. And you might like to offer your own question or your own comment as you're listening to our conversation today. 1-800-316-316. Our special guest is Drug Educator Shane Varcoe. He's CEO at Dalgarno Institute. There is a dalgarnoinstitute.org.au website. They've also got a website called nobrainer.org.au, and you can subscribe for newsletters there. They've got a YouTube channel, and we might even get a chance to talk about World Resiliency Day. There's a website for that too, worldresiliencyday.com.au. We're back with more after Vision National News. Wonderful to have you with us. It's the Friday edition of 2020. If you're just joining us, you're joining into perhaps the most important conversation you'll hear today around your own children, maybe your grandchildren, your family, your community. We're talking drugs. We're asking, how will a new generation resist legalized temptation as more states and territories are moving to decriminalize drugs? How do you think this will impact our children, our teenagers, young people as they face legalised temptation? The push to decriminalise recreational drugs like heroin, cocaine and speed is gaining pace. Since the ACT's drug law reform announcement late last year, there's lots of talk about decriminalisation and other drug policy changes. We've been talking about what's happening in individual states and territories. And what do we make of the push to legalise cannabis? Well, we're talking today about what these changes might mean to you, your family, your community, and which states are following on the heels of those states and territories that are already moving that direction. We're back with drug educator Shane Varcoe. Shane is CEO at Dalgarno Institute. It's one of the 400-strong member organisations of the World Federation Against Drugs. Our talkback line is open on 1-800 316 316. Shane, a bunch of people trying to get through. Let's take some calls and we'll go through these as quickly as we can. But Alex is on the line from Richmond in New South Wales. Hi, Alex. Welcome along.
Thank you. How are you?
Very well, Alex, and thanks so much for waiting patiently. What are your thoughts?
Okay, I've got 2 points. The first is obviously a health concern. I understand the impact that illicit drugs has on a person's health. But having said that, at the moment it's criminalised. So the health issues are in the hands of criminal syndicates because they're making the money off it. Now, if we decriminalised it, it'd be taxed, and that tax money could be used to support the health of people associated with illicit drugs, like tobacco. The second point is the question of free will. Do we want to live in a nanny state, or do we want to live as God intended with a free will to choose what we do?
You know, there are some good points you're making here, Alex, and let's get a thought or two from Shane.
Yeah, look, Alex, you're not the first person to bring that one up. Unfortunately, the realities of revenue from illicit substances is a complete fallacy. In fact, it is a black hole. And what we found in the argument that obviously the US, Uruguay, and Canada all presented was we legalise weed because the bad guys are selling it and making all this money. Once we legalise it, we'll tax it. Now, here, just a quick, this is a long procedure, but quick response. You've got a currently illegal drug. The bad guys don't stop growing marijuana, for example. Let's use weed as an example. They don't stop growing it because the government says we're going to find legal sources. They grow it, and what happens in illegal states, and we've got one of our DART team members is from the US, emergency doctor in Colorado. What happens is shops. They have the shops selling the marijuana, government-approved marijuana. You go in to buy your bud. Your buds cost you, let's say, $100 for a few grams, right? So you got $100, and of that $100, $25 is tax. But you can go to your old mate around the corner who's still growing weed and pick it up for $50. So not only you got a taxable a tax regime in place. What happened when America legalized weed and then commercialized it? What happened was we had three markets. The illicit market, not only did it continue, it grew. The legal market stalled and stagnated, but had to be policed. And the grey market, which was the badly managed bureaucracy, was also in play. And we got rid of the police enforcing possession laws on marijuana, but at the same time they had to go had to do enforcement around people not complying to the legal marijuana laws. So all of a sudden, all the policing issue didn't really change. Expenses around policing didn't change. The healthcare issue continued to grow because more people were using weed, and the revenues from it were supposed to be this cornucopia of response, dried up very fast, and the revenues were diverted to other things. And all of a sudden now, the best way they can do with what little revenue they get is try and stop people using drugs. So you've got this real mess where you had one market before, now you got three. And of course, secondly, free will, that's a big issue. We won't go into the details here, but again, if we follow a Judeo-Christian value, then our free will is always, and I think the book of Romans talks about this, it's always about the other person. It's never about you. So what can I do to serve and enable and equip the other to be the best they can be? And if that's what we are supposed to be doing, others focused, then our free will should be to serve others and help them become the best they be, not just use our free will to do whatever we want to suit our own agenda. But yeah, it's a complex issue and a big one.
Alex in Richmond, thank you so much for your contribution today. Good stuff. 1-800-316-316 to join the conversation. Let's take another call. John is in Melbourne. Hi, John. Welcome.
Hello,
John.
I haven't spoken to you for a while. Yes, about the drug situation. I mean, we've got to be a realist, and we're no longer really a Christian nation. That's number one. Number two is we consume more drugs than per capita than, especially the meth, than anyone else around the world. So there's massive supply and demand. So there's obviously, as long as people use drugs, there's going to be a massive industry there. You can't keep anyone honest because the amount of money that's involved. You obviously can corrupt just about anyone at the right price. So you're talking about police officers. You're talking about the whole system all the way up that's corruptible with millions of dollars of paychecks. Now, anyone that's desperate will take risk and they'll take the money. Now, the point is, I understand where you're coming from. I think we're no longer in a Christian moral society. So you just can't do what you used to do before because a lot of this stuff would have been regulated within the community. We live in a liberal society. We've got a democratic society, so you can't go too hard on people because if you go too hard, then you affect everyone else. So damn if you do, damn if you don't. It's costing us millions of dollars trying to reinforce it all to obviously try to keep the snakes out of the lid. But the problem is you got the law enforcement, which is obviously part of the corruption. So I don't see a way out of this at this stage of history. I don't think we can solve these problems, and I think they're stuck and they're desperate, and that Lord, they don't know how to solve this issue.
And John, it's one thing, isn't it, to throw your hands up in despair and say, "Oh, woe is us! We can't solve the problem, therefore we ought not try." Let's get a thought here. A thought here from Shane. Shane, your thoughts for John?
Yeah, well, John, look, I hear your comments are all legitimate, and I absolutely, I can echo the sentiment behind them. I hear that. And as the old argument is, laws don't change society. Society changes laws. And politics is downstream from culture. We know that. So when a culture is, as you said, we're no longer a Judeo-Christian nation. That's clear. No problems at all. But one thing about the as I understand from the Christian incursional message is that when Jesus came, he came into an environment that was corrupt, completely corrupt, beyond anything we could imagine. It was morally bankrupt, beyond anything we can imagine, even though we're getting close to that now. And yet he inserted himself into that space and birthed a mechanism for retrieval, recalibration, and renewal. It was called the church. So it's interesting that there's in a back end of the world called, at the end of the Roman Empire, a little place called Israel with a backward, according to the Romans, a backward culture. Then the creator of the universe inserts himself in that space and starts a movement to shift the world away from that brokenness and bring it back to restoration. So I think whilst you're completely correct, it is like, what do you do? And from a legislative perspective, you can't. And this is where the agency of the renewing church is a very important one. And what does that look like when it comes to building back into the community the capacity to resist the demand for the drug use? And your comments are interesting. When you change demand, supply stops. Now, also restricting supply also slows demand. We know that from the heroin epidemic in the 90s. When they cut off supply, heroin use dropped considerably and deaths from heroin dropped. So they both work in concert. So supply reduction is important, but you're right, demand must decrease. So how do we reduce demand for in a self-medicating, pleasure-seeking culture? That's a really good question.
All right, John, thank you so much for that. And just to add something to the conversation around Australia as a Christian nation, and there's a lot of people who love to say Australia is no longer a Christian nation. They may be right, but our heritage is absolutely, definitively Christian. So somewhere along the line, someone has dropped the ball, and we might even point to ourselves in the way that has happened. But because we have this wonderful, rich heritage, it doesn't mean we give up on where that heritage has got us going, and we might be at a point where we need to fight a little harder, but there is some challenges there for everyone who thinks that somehow or other, if it's no longer a Christian nation, that we don't have any responsibility. We might be missing the point. We're taking calls, 1-800-316-316. Let's continue to take some calls. Let's take a call from a listener in Tatura in Victoria. Hello, welcome along.
Hi, how are you?
Very well. What are your thoughts?
I just wanted to make a comment in regard to the gentleman that called in about the ADHD medications and things, because I think we do need to stop demonising that.
Sure.
As someone who was diagnosed late in life and has learnt a lot in the last 8 months of being diagnosed, we just need, up to 40% of people in our jails, it is thought, are people that are undiagnosed with ADHD and were not managed as children. So part of it, I think, comes back to that sort of thing as well, that if we could manage that, we can, stop people from the people with ADHD and those sorts of things, looking for the thrills and then turning to alcohol and drugs to then self-medicate for something that is life-changing if you get the correct medication.
You make a really good point. I want to thank you for calling in and making this contribution. Your thoughts here, Shane?
Oh, look, I couldn't agree more. I think the difficulty, as I think I clearly stated, it's very important that these diagnosed illnesses are treated correctly. And I did say that proper pharmaceutical management through their professionals is a very important diagnosis. If that's a diagnosis, to take you up on your ADHD issue, it's interesting, not to contra that, but it's interesting, they were saying up to 10, 15 years ago, 25% now of incarcerants in American jails were actually sufferers from FASD. Now, this is another dynamic in play, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Now, we now know from the science, and that took a long time to get that forward, but when children, and it's totally preventable, but also irreparable, unfortunately. And people with FASD need highly managed. They have all sorts, and they look like ADHD people. And it was the alcohol that caused that problem in the first place. Substance use during pregnancy does that as well. So again, there's behavioural issues, there's genuine ADHD issues that are born out of any number of factors. Then there is FASD issues. So there's a complex mix here. But what we do know is that when you introduce pharmaceuticals, and to an adult person, obviously it's a very important thing, but to a child, it's got to be done very carefully and properly diagnosed, carefully diagnosed, accurately diagnosed, and then treated properly with all the other variables that are important. And I think that's really important. And your comments are correct. If it's done quickly and early, it's important. Just on the FASD issue, it's really important that it can be behaviourally managed. For example, I think it's the Resident footballer Tippin Woody. He was born with FASD, and he was raised adopted by non-Indigenous parents, and they cared for him and managed for him, and they worked with him for a long time. And he's a successful footballer. And he says himself, learning was terribly difficult. Behaviour and mood swings, all those things were awful, but they can be managed and they can be developed. And medication may have been part of that as well. So again, not in any way speaking against the need for that and the proper diagnosis. But of course, there's a lot of factors involved, and of course, substances create a set of problems themselves that we want to avoid with young people.
Thank you so much to that caller. 1-800-316-316. Let's take another call. Kimberly is in Adelaide. Hello, Kimberly. Need to be quick. What are your thoughts?
Hi, I'm just calling. I actually just wanted to give another perspective. I'm against the legalisation of most illicit drugs, but when it comes to marijuana, cannabis, I've been in the system with a young child fighting cancer, and I've come across quite a few children who have actually been kept in remission through the use of high-dose cannabis oil. So I suppose my question is, what do you say to that? We don't have, they have legalised some form of cannabis, able to be dispensed to patients, but it's not actually in a high enough dose. And there isn't a lot of support for that use. But seen it in person, keep kids alive.
Kimberly,
and,
you're making a good point here. Let's get a thought or two from Shane on medical use for cannabis.
Oh, Kimberly, I have to really strongly disagree with you. Unfortunately, the science on this is quite clear, and personal experiences are always there. There is no curative capacity in cannabis at all, no curative capacity at all. And we know from Charlotte's Web and all the other things that we got reams of data on this, research from around the world. Yes, it has got some therapeutic applications, no argument, but unfortunately propaganda has led many people, and those stories that keep perpetuating. It doesn't remit cancer. It doesn't slow it down. There'll be other factors involved. And the science on this has been quite aggressive and strong. And pharmaceutical companies want this to work, because if they can harness cannabis, this miracle drug, to stop cancer, don't you think they'd be grabbing it and running with it? They're not trying to stop it. They're trying to manage it and trying to grab it and make money out of it. So unfortunately, I have to disagree with you on that. Our website is replete with data about the failed promises of cannabis. But you're right, yes, it does have already some therapeutic properties as well. But yes, that's another conversation for another day.
Kimberly, thank you so much for your call. Let's take, I think, one more call, because I want to be able to talk about what we do about this. Rose is in Brisbane. Hi, Rose. Welcome.
Hi, Neil.
Rose, what are your thoughts? I think you've got your radio on in the background. You need to turn that down.
Oh, yes, sorry. Well, it seems to me that Shane answered his own question and solved his own problem a few minutes ago when he mentioned the children growing through the formative years. It seems to me we're doing a lot of backtracking after the horse has already bolted, and I wonder if there could be a gap here for children about 12 or 13 who are taught all about the effects of drugs to their brain, their body, their lifestyle, their hip pockets, as well as about morals and ethics and all kinds of lifestyle training before they get to those years where they seem to be let loose and savage.
Rose, you're making a good point, and of course Shane is a drug educator, and your response here for Rose, Shane?
Great segue. Look, what you're talking about there, and I did indicate to you before, is what's called rites of passage. The Western individualistic culture that disconnected itself from all sorts of tribal meaning has basically abandoned the need for a rites of passage. We basically let to our own devices. We just emerge and become whatever we want to be. But rites of passage have been part of all cultures around the world for millennia. And it's only the Western individualistic West that's jettisoned, obviously, Judeo-Christianity as its meta-narrative and its informing agency. And it's gone, we'll just make it up as we go along. And consequently, the cultural development of the child has been abandoned to basically market forces and whatever the strongest voice is in the marketplace. Now, there's a principle, and I just want to give you this anthropological principle. Our perception of what is real is developed through recency, frequency, proximity, and intensity. In other words, what you're immersed in, what you're subject to, what you're bombarded by will inform how you think, tick, what your values are, whatnot. Now, if you don't have any deliberate and clear meaning, purpose, and process for maturation, then it is left to the devices of the market. And what we're seeing today, and this is where we've started a new initiative, it's not a new initiative, but added to our initiative of resiliency building into the community. Because when the government obviously under legislative mandates is throwing our communities under the bus, and that's what they're doing with liberalising drug policies. When you do that, well, then it's up to the community to create a resource, a capacity within its young people to do that. And what you've just suggested, having your kids go through rites of passage, is really important. So they're growing and they're developing. They're not being subject to the market forces or whatever screaming noise comes out and is the loudest voice, but they actually develop a sense of meaning. And we also know, and we've said this before on this program, but it's really important. Now, another anthropological principle is that boredom, and this is the most bored generation that's ever lived on the planet, apparently, and we've asked this question in schools all over the country. Put your hand up if you thought in the last 10 minutes to the last 24 hours, I'm bored. Every hand goes up. And it's interesting, these kids are the most entertained generation that's ever lived on the planet, bar none. but it's simultaneously the most bored. Anthropologists tell us that boredom's got nothing to do with, or very little to do with, the lack of entertainment, and everything to do with the lack of meaning. Now, when meaning is missing, then hope is missing, and resiliency is not built, then of course people act out, they rebel, they self-medicate, or they're just bored and they just want to have a thrill. So all those factors come together. So you're right, we need to reinvest that, and our schools and our churches and our communities are part to do that. Because if you rely on the government to do that, they're going to just be subject to market forces. Whatever the loudest voice is out there will be the one that gets the squeaky wheel, is like gets the grease. So again, our concern for us in Dalgarno, we've set up a new project called the World Resiliency Week or World Resiliency Day in June, and it's a new website that we've got going to help people build resiliency back into the young people. And it is a day-by-day thing, a family-by-family thing. And mums and dads still have, despite all the rubbish that's been thrown at them, still have the greatest capacity to build resiliency into the young people. If they too have got a good sense of who they are, why they are, and how they are, they can be a great agency of building resiliency into the young people.
Rose, thank you so much for your call. And just a minute or two really left for our conversation. When we say that terminology, our legislators keep throwing us under the bus. Very nice to the thought that you might have some sort of rite of passage, and that might happen around those early teenage years, or even the transition from primary school into high school. A great time to be able to be an influence on children as they're moving into that adolescent, adult stage. But so far as this sort of resiliency, how do we empower our communities? How do we take personal responsible ways of addressing this with our families? What about our churches? Any thoughts here from you, Shane, as we just sort of tie some loose ends together?
Yeah, look, as I kind of intimated just previously in the statements, look, I think it's really important that change agency in the community, we're going back to that incarnation of the Christ, he the God of creation inserts himself in the backwater of the corrupt, rebellious, violent, perverted empire, one of the most perverted empires running the world. And he creates a new movement, which is others-focused, which is sacrificial, which is servant-based, which has very clear meaning. It's founded on truth, ethics, values. And what it does is it continues to live those out, obviously empowered by its author. So I think those things, the church today has the capacity to be that change agent in the community, to offer an environment that is resilient, that builds resiliency, that gives meaning, purpose, direction, values, and the support mechanisms needed for families to be the potential that democracy should be enabling them to do, to keep them from harm and to help them be the most productive they can be, and not just simply find a new way to get off on whatever and try and survive the damage of that. I think distilled down to that brokenness, you know that there's another agency needed to make a difference, and I think the church is that agency.
Well, it's been a great conversation. It's been an eye-opener on a whole lot of different levels. I want to thank you, Shane Varcoe, and I know you've got a team. You're a drug educator charity. It's an health education charity. I know you actually do like to have some supporters. A few more friends might always be useful. Even some who might support your charity in a financial sense, that would be useful too. And for listeners who are listening in today, you might want to check out some of these resources and become a friend of Dalgarno Institute insofar as what sort of resources might be supporting you and your family and your community right now. The website's dalgarnoinstitute.org.au. Those ones that are really practical and look fabulous for your children and teenagers, and talking the no-brainer website, nobrainer.org.au, and you can subscribe there and you can receive those newsletters in the mail. There's a YouTube channel too, and you'd be able to see lots of great content there. And Shane, you did mention worldresiliencyday.com.au. It's a new website.
.com or .com.au, yep.
.com.au. So there's a bunch of website addresses there. I'm sure that Shane would love to have contact with you personally if you have some concern or you'd like to ask another question. Shane Varcoe, CEO, Dalgarno Institute. Shane, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Always a pleasure, Neil. Thanks for having me.